So can you
But
tell me how bad the social media abuse affected you?
well, I'd be surprised if anybody would fail to be affected by the amount of abuse I was personally getting through social media. As the time has gone on, I've got no sort of medical confirmation of this, but I suspect, looking back, I was probably under some sort of depression in the first year or so. But I listened to Peter Hill's interview, where he quite correctly responded by saying that there's nobody in the boardroom at Hereford United over the years that would make any decision that was to worsen the football club deliberately. And yet, when the experts get hold of things, usually after the event, and the criticism comes in, the added social media impact now through keyboards is enormous. We're in a hugely changed world from 20 years ago, and there are some people, I think, across to the young woman on Love Island, I think it was, who took her own life. Some people just cannot cope with the intense criticism that it's possible to do these days, and hopefully I've come through with a bit of a thicker skin than that.
Reading your programme notes for the Gateshead game, Saturday 12th of April 2014, the club was in a right mess. We had HMRC bills to pay. Omid Jalali did the fundraising gig at the Courtyard. We had children selling toys on eBay, donating their pocket money. How did you feel personally when you had children having to give away their possessions to try and keep the club alive?
Well, that was obviously a very difficult time for the club, for everybody involved. We were pleased that people from all sources were helping, as you say, families, children, etc. Omi's comedy shows. We actually had a sponsorship of £10,000, I recall, from Heineken. And in total, those sources raised about 50% of the tax bill, about 35,000 from memory. And it gave us, the directors, a chance to settle that by paying the balance between us. But yeah, a very difficult time when you know that you are literally in debt to people, when the club's finances had reached such a poor state. But I would add that with the alternative social media agenda that was growing, it became very personalised at that time. We'd heard in the boardroom that one of the recently departed directors of the new football club was openly saying in the Addison's bar that his purpose in life is to get Keyte out after a match. Things like that. It's a small city, small setup, and most things get back around. But on social media, it was things like "get your hand in your pocket, Keyte," and it's probably worth me pointing out clearly for people that David Keyte was never the owner, technically, of Hereford United Football Club. The media, particularly TV, radio, and Tim Russon used to refer to it as lazy journalism, would often start things off as owner, chairman, and so on. When in actual fact, when we went in and bought Graham and Joan Fenness's shareholding, it was 27% of the club shareholding. So it's not for me to speculate looking backwards, but if Graham had never held any more shares than that, he was never the owner of Hereford United. And my share of that was 17%, and Tim had 10%. And even between 2010 and 13, the board itself, with initially Grenville involved and then latterly Dave Preedy and Nick Nenadish coming on board, the total shareholding for the board at Hereford United was never more than 30%. And the other 70% was scattered across approximately 1,200 people who over the years had bought a share or 2 or 10 or whatever in Hereford United, going right back to the days when it helped to build the Len Weston stand in the 70s. So I think it's fair to say there's some irony when linked across to the new outfit, where supporters are dipping into their pockets daily to try and raise money to get to 50% of the shareholding, when in actual fact, for whatever part of 90 years, the supporters had, certainly in my time, the supporters had 70% of the shareholding already.
You invested heavily in the youth team, the obvious success being Jared Bowen, who now plays for West Ham in the Premier League. Was there a frustration that Martin Foyle didn't blood the youngsters earlier, with the potential of possibly selling one of them in the January 2014 transfer window?
Well, that's a difficult one. It wouldn't work quite as neatly as that, I don't think. But the youth team and community setup was originally my idea when we first got involved. It was yet another of our off-the-field plans to get the football club back in amongst the local community and give some local kids a chance. I mean, I'd been lucky enough to play as a schoolboy under Colin Addison, and in fact I've still got my Football League registration stub in the drawer next in the bedroom, signed by Reg Tidball, which is a bit sad, but so we had a youth set up. The likelihood of success is minimal, I think, which would be perhaps a touch harsh, but Herefordshire is not the strongest county for sport and producing youngsters, but we felt it was the right thing to do, and we were looking for a new Steve Emery or a Mick Hill, Stuart Phillips. They have come out of Herefordshire in the past, but not in huge numbers. But we did have, of course, a couple of lads from Leinster, Jared Bowen and Billy Murphy, and I actually thought Billy was the better prospect, which shows just how much I know. But as to the first team at the time, difficult situation. I can understand why Martin didn't rush to put the youngsters in. Somebody once said, "You don't win anything with kids," which I can't do in a Scottish accent for you. But when Peter Beadle was asked to come in, he had a bit more of a last throw of the dice mentality to those last few games. He knew the boys well from the youth teams, and he probably had a closer handle than Martin Foyle, who might be able to bridge the gap. And they came in, and Jared and Billy did very well together with the other lads, and obviously we stayed up on that great day at Aldershot. To answer your question about the value, it's very difficult. Unfortunately, the days of lower clubs making money out of academies have probably gone. I remember, I think it was Jermaine Defoe moved as a youngster for 100,000. Unlikely to happen again now, because the player progress path that came out a few years ago has a fairly rigid valuation formulas that includes number of years at the club, etc. And so I suspect if a Jared or a Billy Murphy had been in the team before Christmas, before the transfer window, and got picked up, I would think we'd probably have an offer of about 5,000, maybe 10,000, and it would all be about the future add-on deals. So in terms of our financial situation, it was probably not, even that was probably not an immediate answer to the problems we were facing, and it would have been somewhere down the track, as we've seen with Jared now, where the bigger money would come through.
So going back to off-the-field matters, when did you first hear about the Agombar Consortium?
Over Christmas New Year, we played Kidderminster Harriers twice, and talking about both clubs' issues in the boardrooms. The chairman up there at the time said that they'd had a meeting with a guy called Jed McCrory, who left Swindon Town, but they thought about things, and they didn't really. They were quite content at the time because they just banked £300,000 for somebody. I think it was Jamil Matt, or maybe Lolly, that went to Scunthorpe. But they were okay at the time, and they didn't feel they needed to bring anybody else in. But he may be of use to you at Hereford, from what they've been reading in the press. So I did pick up the phone and spoke to Jed McCrory and met up with Jed McCrory, who wanted to stress that he had no plans to get involved. But in fact, I think he was still in a dispute at Swindon, but he knew a number of people and could probably put names to us. And that's how it started. And one of the names was the Agombar group.
So when was your first conversation with Tommy?
The first time I spoke to Tommy Agombar was when we were away on holiday in Barbados, and the phone rang one day, and it was Agombar. I wondering if it was possible to meet up. So I obviously had to tell him that I was away, but we were back, I think, the following week, and we arranged to meet up in London, which I did. So that would have been somewhere in mid to late April 14, which is probably worth saying at that point, Matt, and social media yet again actually belies the fact that Agombar had owned Hereford United for 12 months by then, or he was seen in the VP club by all these people that saw fit to jump in and start to spread inaccurate, if not untruthful, social media rubbish. But I met him first in towards the end of April down in London.
Going back to those programme notes, you were in Barbados around April 2014. Can you accept the support or criticism that whilst it was all going wrong back in Hereford, you were, in their eyes, on holiday away in the Caribbean?
Yes, absolutely I can. Would I have made a different decision? No, I don't think I would. For the record, on a personal level, my wife Lorraine was on dialysis by then after having kidney failure, and it's very difficult to organise dialysis abroad, not least the cost of it. And I remember we discussed it both at home and in the boardroom, thinking, I shouldn't really be going, but the people in the club and the boardroom said that go and have your holiday. You need it, and we can look after the shop until you're back. So we did go, but what I'd add is that I was in touch daily on Skype with board members. I think I may even have had a chat with Louisa while I was away, and I spoke most days with Luke Graham, the captain, who about any money that was coming in, we were trying to pay down different players, and Luke administered that for me, really well. So it was no different to me getting in the car and driving across to Hereford to the ground and having the same conversations. And sadly, I suppose around us at the moment with coronavirus, I think it's probably a more regular model moving forward that the world will get used to. But yes, I understand, Keyte deserting a sinking ship. But there are occasions where I put family first, and that was one of them. And there is a real possibility, quite frankly, that you can be out of the country, away from the office for 2 weeks, and actually not be able to do, whether you were there or not. The situation was very difficult to influence whether you were in the office or not. So we took the break, and the criticism followed.
So going back to Tommy, did you know about his checkered past?
Yes.
And did you think that he would have failed the fit and proper persons test?
I knew for certain he would that. But that wasn't the discussions we were in. The structure that had been proposed, I remember in our own boardroom that I would be prepared to stay on as their chairman. And I remember Dave Preedy asked if it could include that he stayed on doing the social, the bars and so on, and Nick wanted to stay in charge of the United and the community. So that was the sort of proposal we went in at, on the basis of, you're going to have it very difficult to run this from Essex, way over in Hereford, and but you need local people involved in the structure. So that was the line of conversation we had, despite this chap's background. I think it's fair to say that I have no evidence of this, Matt, but there's probably a lot of football clubs around the country and beyond where the people who are putting the money in may or may not pass individually, may or may not pass the owner's test, but they can still, they still get their involvement in the club. Would Chelsea supporters rebel and boycott the club because Abramovich got involved? Where would they be now? Manchester City likewise, and Leeds United have had flurries recently. And there will be many others. But unfortunately, as the days went on, he couldn't stay in that box. He needed to be the person in front of the microphone, and that was never going to be a happy ending, I don't think. So, and then when we stepped aside, local people stepped out because he increasingly wanted to use his own people. I can remember putting Pete Beadle to them, and I believe he met with them. They'd got this Ellis chap, the next world beater, and so on. So, and of course, then when he didn't do the first part of paying down the immediate outstanding wages and things like that, not surprisingly, they lost the support of the office and other people that had helped the club and were owed money, and so it went on, and actually it just fed the alternative local agenda, who through social media were able to get a groundswell of anti going on, and eventually boycotted the matches and so on.
So just to clarify, you sold the club to Tommy for £1 and then he took on the debt?
Yes.
Yeah, and was there any regret that you sold it to Tommy?
Well, the deal was quite normal. £1 would take on all the debts. The regrets only came about, with hindsight, when things moved away from the original structural agreement, as I said earlier, and they then failed to make those early payments and lost face in Hereford. So regret that it didn't run through as planned, but actually the original discussions could have worked. He had the money. He appeared to be passionate about his football. I think he is passionate about his football. But when you walk into local angst, let's say when you create local angst, you're starting to push water uphill somewhat. So, yeah, for the Hereford United that I've supported for 50-odd years, 90 years in history, you've got to have regrets that it didn't come through properly. But I will always say to you, I think there was a helping hand from certain local bodies.
As I understand, Tommy was paying £2,500 a month to you as part of the agreement, and potential percentage on any redevelopment. Is that true?
Yes. We discussed my wish hope to get a little bit back out of the 500,000 plus that I'd put into the football club. And they were open to that discussion. There was no pressure on whatever figure was agreed. There was no pressure on. And in fact, I agreed to something over 10 years. In round figures, it was £300,000, which 2,500 a month would take 10 years. I had the first payment, and then things went awry. Had to go to court and got a court order for that suggested that the contract was valid. And the other angle of it is if they developed behind the goal at either end, that would be an opportunity of paying me out by some means inside the 10 years, but no pressure on getting the money back.
Hypothetically, if the trust had come to you and said, look, we'll buy the club, take on the debts and not pay you personally any money, is that something that you would have entertained?
Well, that is a bit hypothetical today, Matt, 6 years later. Looking back, I believe we treated Hust very fairly as a genuine potential third interested party when we met them. There were two other groups talking to us at the time. And I recall when we met, they had a small group of 8 or 9 people in the boardroom. I recall discussing, as we had for consistency with all the people, saying there was an immediate 300,000 that the club was in need of, and stating again the need to have. They needed to be aware that you need in the conference about 300,000 a season at Hereford, and though I do remember saying to them that they uniquely, compared to the outside interest, could probably save about 100,000 a season by using local volunteers for various things. But they had no evidence of funding, though they did say they had pledges. They had nobody nominated to do due diligence. Their chairman, Chris Williams, had sent his apologies in, wasn't even at the meeting. And after a couple of hours, we agreed that they would go away to seek further advice from the National Body for Supporters Trust, I think was the title. Martin Watson had made minutes, and after the meeting he sent me a brief script for me to sanction to go out on the Bulls News, which was absolutely fine, and that we'd had a positive, constructive meeting, but they were to go away and seek advice. But sadly, they never came back. So discussions about an offer, personal or otherwise, we never got close to. In fact, as time has passed by, it's so easy to put pieces together on what you read, possibly make 2 and 2 make 5, but maybe Chris Williams, the chairman, had been advised not to attend, perhaps by the people that he and his colleagues had already got into bed with, allegedly. We know now, of course, that they'd already opened up an alternative company in April 2014 when the rest of us were still battling to stay in the conference. Admittedly, it was called something else, Hado Land, I think. But when you see that the registered office was the home address of a former director of Hereford United, finance director, you do wonder quite what other alternative agendas are already in play at that time. But the chairman of Hust didn't attend the meeting. So sadly, we have to accept that local people who could have saved Hereford United chose not to do so. And I would say it appeared that Hust's interest, though disorganised, shall we say, was genuine that evening.
Hereford United continued for the next 6 months, but there was a boycott going on, crowds of 300-400 supporters. It was a real miserable time. The club was liquidated 19th of December 2014. How did you feel on that day when the judge killed off the club?
Yeah, very difficult day. As I've said before in this interview, when you've been going along to Edgar Street since 1964 for about 50 years, And you'd like to class some of your better friends as, the Addison, Isaac people. Very difficult to see those 90 years wiped out. And yes, 4 of those years were when I was involved, and the debate would continue as to whether that caused the demise, was the demise, or whether the next people in didn't handle themselves properly, or whether the local people made sure that they didn't because they wanted the club themselves in some form. The debate would go on and on, but I was thankfully stepped away from it by December of that year. But like everybody else, when you hear it on the radio or wherever it was, disappointing time.
Chris Swan at Redditch was interested in Edgar Street, and there was a rumour that you were involved in showing him around the ground in early 2015. Was that true?
Yeah, that was true. I had a call from Chris at Redditch to say he was interested in knowing a bit more about the situation. The ground is empty, not being used. The club's in liquidation. Hereford United has gone into liquidation, and the local outfit are getting together with the council. And I remember saying to Chris, I said, yeah, I'd gladly meet you and show you around. He'd said that the council had offered some sort of council person to open the door for him, that he'd have to make his own way around. And he wondered if I was prepared to go and meet him and point out various things, inside the ground, which I agreed to do. But I remember saying to him, I think you'll find it's a done deal. But to my mind, the local people were the only ones that the council were going to talk to. But he came over, I met him, and we had a look round. And of course, Hereford being Hereford, by the end of the day, the grapevine has got it that Keyte is involved at Redditch United, trying to set up a new club. So Chris Swan, sure enough, did go and meet the council. He told me, and he felt that I was right. That actually he didn't get much of a input, and that's as far as that one went.
And we go on to our final question of this 4-part series. David Keyte, do you have any regrets?
Do you mean past the obvious one about keeping £500,000 in my own bank account? Looking back, I probably was a bit soft in the boardroom, giving everybody an equal vote when the finances suggested that there was a disproportionate input, and probably I should have pushed through my thoughts more strongly than I actually did. And I think the other one would be, as my old schoolmate Dave Benjamin said to me in the outset, I probably should have done a bit more homework on the local politics, because it's clear to me that some names crop up time and again over the last 15 years of Hereford, who were obviously skirting the edges of the club previously. And in Graham's time, same sort of characters who would criticise Graham Turner would then criticise me as if nobody other than themselves could do it properly. And eventually they had an agenda that worked. So I think probably I should have found out a bit more about those local groups prior to jumping in. But that's life, and we move on.